The big kid didn't move. Oof. I didn't even know why he didn't move at the time. I realized how rooted his spot up to fear. His t-shirt whistled around him, and he started the truck. His eyes wide, mouth open, a scream echoing from his mouth. He tried to raise his hands to cover his face, but as if his thin arms would defend him from the metaphoric 10-wheeled truck was charging out of control towards him. He was screaming and screaming and screaming. The truck roared down the street, and even though it was almost 30 feet away from where I'm standing, I felt that the air hit me like a hard gust as it charged me down the big kid. The truck didn't even collide with him. It simply poured over where he stood, his body buckling underneath it, folding it like it was made of paper. His head at the height of the top of the wheels was tore free. There wasn't much blood, but the force of the truck colliding with the big kid ripped the boy's head from the shoulders and sung it hurting across the road. The big kid's head was struck the road as it suddenly nothing more than a hunk of meat, like a prop in the movie. I wasn't screaming. I couldn't. My throat simply wouldn't make a sound, except for the series of wheezing grasps as I tried to pull through air in my lungs. I couldn't scream because I couldn't breathe, but there was screaming in the air, and I couldn't figure out who was screaming. I then realized that I've heard the big kid's head swaying lightly on the side of the road in the gutter, emptying its last sounds from the ruin of his throat. An awful scream ran out of the severed neck, and just for a few short seconds, the truck had finally stopped where it was, and it breaks up, bringing up to a small all too late. But beneath its wheels was the big kid's body, twitched for moments before, his arms playing out the last moments of his muscle memory as he tried to feel around the empty air above his shoulders. The witch had kept its collection of her heads, so she changed to them and would wear the different ones depending on her mood. And after a few short, terrible seconds of the movement ceased, the screaming stopped. The big kid, who was less than a minute before had been a living person, had rendered into pieces of unmoving matter, human meat, broken apart and empty. My mother ran from the bakery over to me and pulled me out of the way, hoping that moving me out of that scene would push me from what I've seen in my mind. But it wouldn't work. I closed my eyes, but the image didn't go away. I could still see the big kid's head on the side of his face, ripped and caved inwards, like a desert bowl. His eyes were in the wrong place, and his mouth open as he let fall last echoes of his scream. Dorothy, of course, had fled from the witch's twitching, lurching body of her collection of her screeching heads, that she had ran away, escaped from the horrors. I wasn't quite so lucky. Some things I couldn't escape from, but they would tell me the place that is space between blinking of my eyes. With the powder of life, Dorothy was able to throw a good mass of assorted items at the witch's tower. A sofa and a moose's head had been a rather random junk, had been brought to life, creating an assorted mishmash of a creature. It was called the Gump, and like Jack Pumpkinhead. It was a jumbled humorous items. Dorothy then flew away on the winged Gump, and flying across the deadly desert. The deadly desert was a massed sand at the borders of Oz, which so much of as you touch the sand, it will cause you to turn into sand yourself. Several of the wheels pursued Dorothy, and when their wheels touched the sand, they collapsed. Their bodies yellowed, cracked, and fell apart, their bodies shifting up to the wind, and the lines have curved their faces, shattering and breaking apart. The Gump rips apart in the air, its wings breaking, and Dorothy and her friends crash-landed onto the mountain of the Gnome King. A sinister creature, formed a living rock of the Gnome King. He was played by Stern and Dick Cormian by Nicol Williamson, a Scottish actor who forged his way many respective Shakespeare's roles and stage on screen before his death in 2011. Williamson also played the doctor from the hospital back in Kansas, that both the sinister doctor and his beastly assistant had been incarnated in Oz. The actors and all makes me more sure that the dark and sinister Oz of this film wasn't flashed in Dorothy's memory as she drowns in the river during that storm. No, she doesn't drown, no matter how many times I tried to remind myself of the story. I kept thinking that she drowned. I've seen the film so many times as an adult, and yet each time I watched it, I find myself thinking as she falls into the churning waters of the river. Is there a point where she drowns? I know in my conscious mind that she doesn't, but each time I think back on this film, I remember Dorothy slipping beneath the thrashing waves, her skin wet and cold, gasping for air, drowning beneath the weight of the water. No, Dorothy does not drown, but that's not the story in the film. I kept remembering the film differently. I keep thinking that she drowns, but she doesn't. She doesn't drown. Dorothy does not drown. She goes to Oz and rescues her friends, who have been captured by the Gnome King. She goes to the Gnome King's treasure chamber, where they have turned all of her friends into ornaments. She brings them back to life. She little did Felenza Bulk in the first film of the role. She did not drown, but she went to be Stacy in America History X. She didn't want to drown. She brings them all to Emerald City and the Gnome King. The Gnome King dies. The evil witch Mombi is then captured by the heroes, but the Gnome King dies. Dorothy's companion, the chicken called Belina, drops an egg into the Gnome King's mouth. The Gnome King at this point has been having a gigantic creation of living rocks, gags, and chokes. He rasps the words, "Eggs! Poison!" and crumbles as his whole entire body breaks apart slowly. Chunks of rocks falling away, his face with it. Eggs poison. Eggs, of course! They are not poisoned, but in the film, they're only poisonous to the Gnome King. I never did understand why, but when I was a child, I didn't even realize that condition purely to the Gnome King and not something that would affect anybody of the other characters, human or otherwise. The statement was simply a proclamation, a warning. Eggs, poison. Whisked it to the face to turn to rock, churned and boiled and fell apart, like pebbles poison. My mother served me a plate of scrambled eggs for lunch. This was 2 weeks before we moved into the city, away from our village home. I had lived in a small village for my entire life. We had no more than 30 buildings, and a single main street with its local shop, pub, schoolhouse, and church. Surrounded that we were by farmland. A large number of our local produce was agriculture, and local beef, pork, and eggs. I pushed the plate away. "Not hungry?" my mother asked. I shook my head. "Poison." I found the nest during the summer. It was hidden in the roots behind an old oak tree, at the back near the church. It had been built for many stray chickens who had nested down amongst the gnarled and twisted roots of the rotting tree. It had been found this one morning, whisked on my way to school. It had been raining the night before, and my rubber Wellington boots were fleckled with mud. It was the sound I heard first. A beating cry. I stepped out through the soggy grass and leaned closer, peering through the shadows of the old tree roots. A nest was wet and full of dirt. 2 chicken eggs sat in the dirt, their surfaces glistering from the rain. The third egg lay in pieces. All of its bits of shell hung like a deflated balloon. The infant chicken had been born too early, and it was premature and half-formed. The body looked like a wet mist of string. Its skin was only black, and it seemed to have muscle and fiber. Its head was way too big for its neck, and it hung limply close to one of the sides. It's open far too wide, and it was twitching as on a string, trying to breathe. Struggling to live, the rest of it was partly there. There was a premature birth, a photos of a creature, more muscle and tissue than life. Its egg had cracked and spilled the chicken to the world, rejecting it. Poison. We didn't have any cafeteria in the school. It was too small in the building. Instead, the local store would have sent a van to the back of the schoolhouse, where the teachers would collect our meals and bring them to the gym hall, which we had doubled as the auditorium. Despite it being significantly too small qualified as one, we sat and ate our lunches. Those who got our lunches from the school van and those who had brought to pack lunch together, my mother made me some ham sandwiches with crusts cut off neatly. I sat with the other 3 kids in my class. Chris was a keen football fan and would usually rush through his lunch in order to finish early so that he could hurry to his yard and kick ball around for a while. Josh was quiet, a bookish sort who had long black hair with a set of strong braces, which shone each time he smiled. And then there was Gary, who didn't speak much, but it followed as if the rest of us sounded around quite eagerly. I chewed on my sandwich for a while, not speaking. Chris was also talking eagerly about the football match that he watched on television last night. I didn't care about football, and his descriptions of kicks and goals seemed almost too much like an alien language to me. He took a bite out of his sandwich and continued to talk, spraying bits of food as he did so. I turned to Josh, wanting to tell him about the nest I found. I told him about the chick, laying squirmingly in the mud around gasping for life. Josh just shook his head. All chickens are little when they're born, he said. I tried to explain that it wasn't simply a baby chick, but it was a half-formed and dying. But I was only a child when it wouldn't form description properly. At best I could explain about it being born wrong. Chris then took another bite out of the sandwich and made a soft coughing sound. Josh said that maybe a fox had found the nest and was eating some of the eggs, and maybe it could have left the dead baby chick behind. I tried to explain that this might be possible when Chris coughed again. I turned to look at him. His face looked wrong, brighter and puffier. He coughed again and again, louder, and began motion towards his throat. The other kids from nearby turned and noticed. As Chris was coughing, he became more insistent. He dropped his sandwich that he had gotten from the lunch van. It fell open. Slices of bread was separating to show the creamy white shade of its contents. Egg mayonnaise. Chris tried to stand up, but he couldn't. Tripping as he did so, Josh rushed forward, trying to slap him out of the back. "Help!" he shouted. Chris was clasping at his throat now, and his face flushing down from pale red to a deeper, more blood-like shade. He was growing frantic and began to panic. He was wheezing for air, and his breath was trying desperately to fill his lungs. But he couldn't, and without air, he would have drowned, choked to death. But it wasn't right. That wasn't what was killing him. I knew what was killing him. It was the poison. The eggs in the sandwich the teacher had been running over. But Chris had fallen to the floor at this point, his grasping gasps for air filling the small hall. He twitched and thrashing for air, his skin turning darker shade of red, and I thought this simply about the chick was doing the very same thing. I grabbed the teacher's arm and said, "It's the eggs," I said, intensely. My eyes were stinging as if felt tears in them. "The eggs! They're poisoned!" Chris was then taken to a local doctor's clinic, where they had found obstruction in his throat. A large piece of eggshell, almost the size of a small coin, had burrowed its way the sharp edge in the inside of his throat. I still don't think the film is cursed, but the whole cursed movie alone thing doesn't work in reality. It may have been the director's only movie, but it doesn't mean that anything about it was unusual. I don't think the video I watched was haunted. No, it was definitely not the movie was haunted, but it was me. By the time she goes back to Kansas, Dorothy's journey is over, and she's found the rightful heir to the throne of Oz, and helped reclaim the world. We learn that the hospital burned down to the ground during the storm. The doctor died in the fire. He burned to death. The Gnome King died, and so did the doctor. Both characters, both played the same actor, met the same fate. But Dorothy was home, and she was wiser, more confident than show her sadness was gone. She can only carry the memory of Oz with her forever. I wonder if it was her curse after all. that poor little Dorothy Gale would forever return to Oz. I stood on the road where the truck had struck and killed the blonde-haired kid. This was about a month ago, when I was in the city for business. I had just finished my new project, the shooting of a new film. When I was 12, I was watching a movie called Cinema Paradiso, a classic modern Italian movie. It follows the story of a young man who grows up in a small village and to who local cinema was a major impact of his life. He goes to grow up to become a respectful film director. And his similarities between our lives. I had wished my 5th feature film. I had begun to wonder just what kind of influence the films I have watched as a child had on me, and how they shaped me into who I was. The character in Cinema Paradiso was blustered with they have given him strength and means of escape. For me, there was one film that terrified me, and that's when I fought back onto the street was the big kid who died in the truck accident. It was only a coincidence that had brought me here. I had to go 2 weeks until editing would begin in the film, and I needed a break, a way to clear from my head. The editing was due to taking place to the main studio, but by the sheer coincidence, my hotel wasn't as far as from the truck accident that had occurred. That evening, I walked into the streets. I thought that I may look the same. I didn't really know. I hoped to find. I didn't want to drown out my memories. Maybe. Just I wanted to see one last time, in order to say goodbye. The video rental store was long since gone. The bakery was still there, though. The young man behind the counter told me that he didn't remember a video store being there a street over ever since he moved into the city. Some 7 years ago, time had changed. I still expected to still see markets of tires from the truck on the road. No, I didn't. No black scorch of burned rubber, and no dash of blood on the gutter where the head was landed. The city had changed. It had moved on. Only my memory remained. There was one last place I had to go. My home village in Cornwall. It had been changed, perhaps more drastically. I drove over there with my white sedan, and when I pulled up to the village's main street, I realized that I had ravaged the piece as far as any other hurricane would. As I determined to not let the weight of my dissuade me from what I intended to do, though, I parked my car and looked around. I tasted the air and looked around. I had drove through the smooth hills, and they were once full of wheat, but now were empty. My Kansas was gone. The air tasted different. This I thought was my own return to Oz. The post office was shut, and it had closed many years before. The small corner shop was just a Safeway. Even so, it was a small one that only a single checkout. I went to my local pub, which I had never done when I was a child here. The man behind the bar barely took notice of me. All around me the people seemed old, and as if the history chewed onto them, and left their wrinkled faces and gnawed. I didn't see any children here. The bartender told me that there wasn't really anything young families around here anymore. No work around here. It seemed that the only people who had once worked on the farms, waiting for the dust of earth to reclaim them. Being in the village was painful. It felt relic that something for the past had to be forgotten. Time had moved on, and I had to move on. The village had not. It struggled, and had lost it. I didn't want to stay for too long. I knew that I wanted to make this quick, before becoming too painful. Before the ghosts of my memories began to haunt me, I left the pub and started on my walk. The school was the closest, so that I went there first. It was a poor decision. The building itself was barren. The sign of the front with the school's name had once been boldly etched out. It had been taken down, and the building was abandoned without any children to teach. There was no use of that school anymore. I learned from the man who owned at the local pub from school that where Chris had choked on a broken piece of the eggshell so many years ago was still occasionally used for the village's meetings. but the classrooms had long since been abandoned. I walked around the building, peering into the rooms. They were all barren, emptied out of furniture, no desks, no chairs. One held a blackboard, and its surface was covered in dust. When I got to church, I realized then before I stepped out into the yard, into that oak tree that had long been gone. I have found the old priest with a shock of dirty white hair trending the front of the church. When I asked him about the tree, he told me that they had caught several disease several years before it was cut down. I walked around to the yard, and sure enough, I found the dry old patch of ground where the tree once stood. The ground felt harder than the soil surrounding it, and rose steadily slump, like a despoiled grave. The old farmhouse had been demolished, and it had been concreted over, as if to prevent anyone else from building here. At the foot of the hill, a large square patch of gray concrete was almost as amongst the tall grass. I almost stumbled across it, because the years had pushed the details of the location from my mind. When I found the patch of concrete, I half expected to fall the small plague as well. Perhaps the desolation of the 4 children who had been murdered and buried there. There wasn't one. The concrete itself was cracked and old by then, and bits of weeds and long grass peeking its way through the nature's own fingertips. It was almost as if the world just wants to forget. I felt tired. The journey had been so painful, bittersweet. I felt as if I made my homecoming, and felt as if the sadness that it would bring. I wanted to leave. Soon the memories were too long, ones that were so powerful for me, but that the rest of the world had done its best to forget. I had made my journey, or so I thought, but it wasn't done yet. The sun was starting to set by the time I reached the river. I didn't really know what brought me there, and I had no idea what guided my steps. I had forgotten that village and the river. In the daylight, I thought that the river might look beautiful, but with the sun starting to die and the red sky slipped down towards the horizon, made the undercurrents of the water look dark. My feet had brought me almost unbidden if I was following the trail that was laid out for me a long time ago. This is where my broken, ruined yellow brick road leads me, and that's when I remembered. This is where she drowned. I don't remember it all at once. The images came first. Her face, her eyes with widened terror, the splashing over her skin, making it glisten, her mouth full and unable to take enough in the air, her short black hair slick against the scalp in utter disarray. The water had kept washing over her face, the dark cloak of its current covering her a few fleeting moments before she broke to the surface again, only to dip back into the icy embrace again. I was on the blank of the water. I was clasping onto her arm, but it was cold on a winter's night, and her coat was too wet, and I was wearing gloves, and she kept slipping. I couldn't hold on. I couldn't get a good grip. I wasn't strong enough. I was only 6 years old and she was 4, and when the river had her, the river held on to its grip, and the water's like fingers had been a better grip on her than I ever could. She was crying and shouting me to help her. The water was weighing her down and stopping her words from escaping. She was drowning, and I was panicking. I was meant to look for her. She was my sister, and when I was her big brother, and when I meant to protect her, I was meant to look after her, and she was drowning. She had fallen and hit the water with a splash, and that splash was so loud that it had broken the world, and I had forgotten.